Encounter with the alien beauty. The barren expanse of the Caldor waste stretched endlessly under a sky tinged with violet streaks, a result of the planet's thin atmosphere scattering its twin suns' light. Commander Jax Hale, a seasoned interstellar explorer, knelt in the powdery soil, examining an unfamiliar crystalline growth that spiraled out of the ground like glass spun by unseen hands. His team, a small but highly skilled crew of 4, fanned out behind him, scanning the terrain with their respective instruments. "This formation doesn't match any recorded mineral compositions in the system," muttered Dr. Raina Voss, the team's geochemist, her voice muffled through her visor. She tapped her tablet furiously, cross-referencing databases as her breath fogged the interior of her helmet. Jax straightened, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the crystal. "Stay sharp. If the crystals are natural, they shouldn't be emitting that kind of energy." He gestured at the faint pulsing light visible even in daylight, a soft rhythm that seemed almost alive. Behind him, Kaelin Tor, the team's linguist and cultural analyst, froze mid-step. "Commander, over here," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Jax strode to her position, boots crunching over the silicate-like soil. Kaelin stood before what appeared to be a perfectly smooth, obsidian-black monolith. It was out of place in the chaotic natural landscape, standing erect and unmarred, as though recently forged. "It's warm," she said, hesitating before placing a gloved hand on the surface. "And it hums like it's resonating." Dr. Voss joined them, scanning the monolith with her handheld spectrometer. "It's not registering as a solid material. It's something else. Organic, maybe?" Jax didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the structure, but his focus was elsewhere, drawn by a growing unease he couldn't articulate. The silence was broken by a shrill tone from their communication devices. Reese Calder, their engineer, had remained near their rover, ensuring the equipment was ready for a quick departure if necessary. "Commander, we've got company," he barked through the comms. Jax turned sharply. "Define company." "Something moving fast." 5 clicks out and closing. Jax felt his pulse quicken. "Defensive positions now." Kaelin Voss, fall back to the rover. Reese, power up the shields. As the team scrambled to regroup, the atmosphere seemed to shift. The violet sky darkened unnaturally, the twin suns dimming as though a veil had been drawn across them. The crystalline formations around them began to shimmer, their pulsing rhythm growing more erratic. And then she appeared. At first, it was a shimmer in the air, a distortion like heat waves rising from the ground. But the distortion coalesced into form, a figure tall and slender, humanoid in shape but distinctly alien. Her skin glowed faintly, iridescent and shifting like liquid metal. Her face, if it could be called that, was an intricate mask of symmetry, with eyes that shone like twin galaxies. The team froze, weapons half raised but uncertain. "Hold your fire," Jax ordered, stepping forward cautiously. His voice was firm, but the grip on his sidearm betrayed his tension. The alien's gaze, or what Jax assumed was her gaze, settled on him. She tilted her head slightly, a gesture that seemed both curious and oddly familiar. "Can you understand me?" Jax asked, his voice steady. The air around her shimmered again, and then she spoke. Or rather, her thoughts spoke directly into their minds. "Understanding is mutual. Your presence here disturbs the harmony." Kaelin stepped forward cautiously, her initial fear tempered by fascination. "We mean no harm. We're explorers, not invaders. This planet is uncharted. We didn't know it was inhabited." The alien's eyes flared briefly, and the crystalline structures nearby pulsed in synchrony with the light. "Uncharted to you. Sacred to us. You tread on the veins of our essence." Dr. Voss whispered. "She's talking about the crystals. They're part of her species? Ecosystem?" Jax raised a hand to quiet her. "We didn't know. We'll leave." But the alien didn't move. Instead, the pulsing in the crystals intensified, and the ground beneath them began to tremble. "You have awakened the core. Its energy destabilizes. If not restored, this world, and yours, will perish." Reese, still at the rover, chimed in over the comms. "Commander, The energy readings are spiking. Whatever she's talking about, it's happening fast. Jax turned back to the alien. Tell us what to do. The alien extended a hand, long and delicate, shimmering as though it were made of stardust. Trust. Jax hesitated. Years of military training warned him against surrendering control, but something in her presence, her undeniable beauty and the gravity of her words, compelled him. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing hers. The world dissolved. In an instant, Jax's mind was flooded with images, sensations, and knowledge far beyond human comprehension. He saw the alien's world as it had been, a vibrant, thriving ecosystem centered around the crystalline core. He felt the balance of energies that sustained not only the planet, but also her species, who were bound to it symbiotically. And he saw the damage his team's arrival had caused, however unintentionally. When the vision ended, Jax was back in the Caldor wastes, his hands still in hers. He staggered, overwhelmed but resolute. "We can fix this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The alien nodded. "The core must be stabilized. You will guide the flow." Dr. Voss stepped forward, her scientific curiosity outweighing her fear. "What does she mean by guide the flow?" Jax turned to his team. "The crystals are conduits. They channel energy, but the balance is off. If we can realign them, redirect the energy back to the core, we might stabilize the planet." Reese's voice crackled over the comms. "That's a big if, Commander. One wrong move, and we could blow ourselves sky high." Jax met the alien's gaze. "Do we have a choice?" The alien stepped back, her form beginning to dissolve into light. "Harmony or destruction? The choice is yours." As she vanished, the ground trembled again, more violently this time. The crystals pulsing became erratic, their light flickering like a dying star. Jax turned to his team, his voice firm. "We're doing this. Reese, calibrate the energy disruptors. Voss, map the crystal network. Kalen, stay on comms and monitor the alien signals. We're not leaving until this planet is stable." The team sprang into action, their fear replaced by determination. As the alien's words echoed in Jax's mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a mission. It was a test, a chance to prove humanity's worth in a universe far greater than they had ever imagined. And as the twin suns began to re-emerge from the darkened sky, Jax felt a sliver of hope. They still had a chance. The exploration. The sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a golden haze across the endless expanse of desert. The arid wind swept through the jagged rocks and twisted shrubs, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of something ancient and buried. Dr. Elena Voss adjusted her wide-brimmed hat, shielding her eyes as she scanned the barren landscape ahead. This was no ordinary excavation site. The coordinates, cryptically sent to her by a long-silent mentor, had drawn her and her team deep into the heart of the uncharted Badlands. "Still nothing," muttered Jasper, her lead technician, tapping a scanner that hummed faintly in his gloved hand. He glanced over at Elena, his expression a mixture of frustration and unease. "We've been out here for hours, and the readings are inconsistent at best. Are we even in the right place?" "We are," Elena replied firmly, her voice steady despite her own doubts. "The geospatial data aligns perfectly with Dr. Hargrove's notes. Whatever is here, it's significant enough for him to risk everything to conceal it." Behind them, their linguist, Meera Patel, was crouched over a fragment of stone half buried in the sand, her fingers tracing delicate, unfamiliar symbols etched into its surface. She squinted, her brow furrowing. "These markings," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension, "aren't any language I've ever seen. But they feel deliberate, like a warning." "A warning about what?" Jasper asked, his voice sharper than intended. Elena knelt beside Meera, her fingers brushing the glyphs. "Warnings are meant to deter," she murmured. "But they also signal value. Something here was important enough to guard, important enough to hide. We need to keep going." As the sun sank further, casting long shadows across the dunes, the group pressed on, their steps guided by the increasingly erratic signals from their instruments. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the terrain, as though even the wind dared not disturb what lay beneath. It was Jasper who saw it first, a jagged opening in the ground, half obscured by a mound of loose sand. He called out, and the others hurried to his side, their breaths catching as they peered into the dark void. The entrance was roughly hewn, its edges marked by more of the strange symbols Mira had been studying. A faint, pulsing light emanated from deep within, casting eerie patterns on the walls. Elena's pulse quickened. "This is it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You're sure?" Mira asked, her hand tightening around the strap of her satchel. "I don't think we have a choice," Elena replied. Jasper secured a line to a nearby rock formation, testing its strength before nodding. One by one, they descended into the fissure, their boots crunching against the loose gravel. The air grew colder still, carrying with it a faint hum that seemed to resonate in their very bones. The chamber they entered was vast, its walls carved with intricate patterns that shimmered faintly in the dim light of their headlamps. At its center stood a monolithic structure, its surface smooth and unbroken save for a single circular indentation. The pulsing light they had seen above emanated from within the monolith, casting an otherworldly glow across the room. "What is this place?" Jasper asked, his voice barely audible over the hum. "A vault," Elena said, stepping closer. Her fingers itched to touch the monolith, but something held her back, a primal instinct she couldn't quite name. Mira was already examining the carvings on the walls, her notebook in hand. "These symbols," she said, "they're evolving. It's like they're responding to us, changing as I look at them." "That's impossible," Jasper said, but his voice lacked conviction. Elena turned to him. "Impossible is why we're here. Whatever this is, it's not natural. It's not human. And we need to figure out why it was hidden." Mira approached the monolith, her gaze fixed on the indentation. "It looks like something fits here," she said, her hand hovering over the surface. Elena's mind raced. Dr. Hargrove's notes had been cryptic, full of half-formed theories and fragmented maps. But one thing had been clear. The artifact they sought was a key, not just to the site, but to something far greater. As if on cue, a low rumble echoed through the chamber. The monolith began to vibrate, its pulsing light intensifying. The team froze, their eyes darting around the room as the walls seemed to ripple like water. "What did you do?" Jasper demanded, his voice rising. "Nothing," Mira said, stepping back. The light from the monolith flared, blinding them momentarily. When it dimmed, they were no longer alone. A figure stood before the monolith, its form indistinct and shifting, as though it were made of smoke and starlight. It spoke, not in words but in a cascade of emotions and images that flooded their minds. A great expanse of stars, a world crumbling to dust, and a warning, urgent, insistent. Elena staggered, clutching her head. The presence was overwhelming, its intent clear even if its message was not. "It's a guardian," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "It's been waiting, watching. But for what? Or who?" Jasper said, his face pale. The figure moved closer, its form solidifying just enough to reveal a shape. A hand extended toward them. In its palm lay an object, a small, intricately carved stone, its surface etched with the same symbols that adorned the walls. "The key," Mira whispered. Elena stepped forward, her hand outstretched. She hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Taking the key felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. But they had come too far to turn back now. Her fingers closed around the stone, and the figure dissolved, its form scattering into 1,000 points of light that swirled around the chamber before vanishing into the monolith. The room fell silent, the hum gone, the air still. "Now what?" Jasper asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena turned the stone over in her hands, its surface warm to the touch. "We find out what it opens," she said, her voice steady despite the unease coiling in her chest. The team exchanged glances, each of them understanding that they had stepped into a mystery far larger than any of them had anticipated. Above them, The desert sky darkened, the first stars appearing in the vast expanse. Somewhere in the distance, a storm brewed, its winds carrying whispers of the unknown. Rain sheeted the windows of the dimly lit shop, the faint glow of lanterns casting fractured light over the myriad of glass objects on display. Each was delicate, impossibly intricate, and impossibly alive. This was Veil and Vessel, an artisan shop nestled in the crooked lanes of Ashgrave, and it was here that Mira had come to solve her brother's mystery. Mira stood near the counter, her cloak dripping onto the worn wooden floor. Behind the counter, a man with sharp cheekbones and calloused hands worked silently, his long fingers twisting molten glass into improbable shapes. There was a rhythm to his movements, an artistry that suggested years of practice and something deeper, something not entirely human. "Do you always just let people linger?" Mira asked, her voice steady but edged with challenge. She needed his attention. Time was slipping away. The man paused, his tongs poised midair. He didn't look up. "Do you always come looking for things you don't want to find?" Mira stiffened. "My brother, Emmerich, he came here 3 weeks ago. He never returned. I was told this was the last place anyone saw him." At this, the man looked up. His eyes were pale, almost translucent, like frozen rivers. "And if he did, then I need to know why." The man, he hadn't offered his name, set the tongs down and wiped his hands on a blackened cloth. "This isn't a place for answers. Only exchanges. If you want something, you must offer something in return." Mira bristled. "I didn't come to barter. I came for him. And yet," he said, his voice low and cutting, "everyone comes here thinking they can take what they need. But the glass remembers." Myra's fingers curled into fists. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, he motioned toward the shelves behind him. "If you insist, then choose." The shelves were lined with glass sculptures, each more elaborate than the last. Trees with leaves so thin they seemed to shimmer with every breath, animals caught mid-motion, and faces that seemed too vivid to be just works of art. One piece, however, drew Myra's attention, a shard-like prism, its edges jagged yet eerily precise. It pulsed faintly, as if it had a heartbeat. "What is this?" she asked, pointing. "A fragment of memory," the man replied. "Yours if you're willing to see." Her pulse quickened. She didn't trust him, but she didn't have a choice. Emmerich was all she had left, and if this was the path to him, she would take it. Without hesitation, she reached for the prism. The moment her fingers touched the glass, the world tilted. She was no longer in the shop. Instead, she stood in a forest, its trees impossibly tall and cloaked in mist. The air buzzed with an unnatural hum, and the ground beneath her feet shimmered like glass. Ahead, a figure moved, a man, his silhouette familiar yet out of reach. "Emmerich," she called, her voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. The figure paused but didn't turn. Mira sprinted toward him, her boots skidding on the glassy ground. Each step seemed to stretch the distance, the figure always just out of reach. "Stop," she shouted. "Please, I need to know what happened." The hum grew louder, oppressive, and the world around her began to fracture. Cracks spiderwebbed through the trees, the ground, the sky itself. The figure finally turned, and Myra's breath caught in her throat. It was Emmerich, but his face was wrong, hollowed, his eyes glowing faintly with the same light as the prism. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was not his own. The price was paid, the voice intoned. "You cannot undo what was willingly given." Mira stumbled backward. "What are you talking about? What price?" But the crack spread, swallowing him whole. She gasped, the world snapping back into the confines of the shop. Her knees buckled, and she clutched the counter for support. The man stood across from her, his expression unreadable. "You saw," he said simply. "That wasn't real." Mira spat, though her trembling hands betrayed her. "What did you do to him?" "I did nothing," he replied. "Your brother came here with a choice. He made it." She shook her head. He wouldn't leave me. Not without a reason." The man's gaze softened, almost imperceptibly. "Not all choices are about leaving. Some are about protecting." Mira froze. "What does that mean?" Instead of answering, He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a small glass vial. Inside swirled a faint golden mist. "This is what remains," he said, holding it out to her. "His choice, his memory. If you wish to understand, it's yours. But remember, understanding comes with its own cost." Her hand hovered over the vial. "And if I take it, then you'll see the truth. But truths cannot be undone." She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to walk away, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But she couldn't, not while Emmeric's fate hung in the balance. With a deep breath, she took the vial and uncorked it. The memory hit her like a storm. She saw Emmerich standing in the shop, the same sharp-eyed man across from him. Only this time, Emmerich looked desperate. "She'll die without it," Emmerich was saying, his voice raw. "There must be another way." The man shook his head. "Life demands balance. If you wish to save her, you must leave something behind." Myra's heart clenched as she realized he was talking about her. "I'll do it," Emmerich said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Take what you must. Just let her live." The man nodded and held out a prism, its edges glinting like a predator's smile. "Then it is done?" Mira blinked, the shop swimming back into view. The vial was empty in her hand, and tears blurred her vision. "He traded himself for me," she whispered. The man inclined his head. "A life for a life. It was his choice." Myra's mind raced. The guilt was crushing, but it was laced with determination. Is there a way to reverse it? To bring him back? The man's expression hardened. "The balance has been struck. To undo it would require something greater." "Then take me," Mira said, her voice firm. He raised an eyebrow. "You would trade your life for his?" She nodded, her resolve unwavering. "He gave everything for me. I'll do the same for him." The man studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "You are braver than most. But the glass does not barter twice." Her heart sank. "Then what?" "There is another way," he interrupted. "But it is not without risk. The shard you touched, if you take it into yourself, you may anchor him back to this world. But his memory will remain fractured. He will not be the man you knew." Mira hesitated. To have Emmerich back, even a fragment of him, was worth any price. "I'll do it," she said. The man nodded and retrieved the prism. "Then let the glass remember." As he pressed it into her hands, its light surged, and the shop dissolved into shards once more. The resolution hinted at sacrifices yet to come, the prism's glow flickering as Mira prepared to rewrite fate itself.